I'm Susan Michaels-Strasser. I'm the Senior Implementation Director for Human Resources for Health at ICAP at Columbia University in New York City. Join me as I talk to some of my friends and colleagues working in nursing around the world today. Maggie Rawlins will be joining us today, having worked on the front lines of the COVID-19 outbreak in Queens, New York, although she comes from Charleston, South Carolina. Maggie, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Great, thank you for being here. Maggie is a registered nurse turned fashion model from South Carolina. Now she's leading her medical skills to patients in need as a registered nurse on the front lines of the public health response to COVID in the United States. Maggie, thank you for lending those skills and your abilities as a nurse, especially here in New York when we were at a point where we needed help. And I still remember I lived down near Times Square, and I remember seeing the buses that were taking nurses from the hotels to the hospitals throughout New York City. And the buses had Harlem and the Bronx and the Queens and Staten Island, and you really people from all over the country came together to help us, and it really was amazing. So thank you.
Of course, absolutely.
So let's begin. What makes you jump out of bed in the morning?
Other than my caffeine addiction and my two dogs, I think that kind of what got me going or motivated me has changed throughout the years. And initially starting as a nurse, I was really, motivated by all the right reasons and wanted to help people and have a purpose bigger than myself. In the past, 4 years or so, I've worked mostly as a model. And, you kind of lose that a little bit. And after being back at the bedside this spring during the pandemic, it kind of just solidified for me that you're the most fulfilled having a purpose, having a calling that's bigger than just yourself. I'm so grateful for the opportunities that I've had with modeling. Of course, those were priceless experiences. But there's really nothing like being fulfilled by serving others, as cliche as that sounds.
It does and it doesn't, because, being a nurse myself, and some days I'm so tired and I'm so frustrated. And I think I was sharing with you that I'm working on the contact tracing program here at our university, and it's tiring. And I just want this pandemic to be over. But when I look back, I know I've had a rich life and I've had rich experiences, and I've been able to be with people at their most intimate, difficult moments, but also at their happiest moments, having babies and seeing success with treatment. And that really is a privilege. And although the world of a model sounds amazing to me, and sometimes I dream about, having a lifestyle like that, it is a privilege to be a nurse.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And as far as the modeling lifestyle, it looks way more glamorous than it actually is in real life.
I bet.
To tell you that.
Like everything.
Yeah.
Can you tell us, you already talked about what drew you to nursing. Could you tell me what you feel is your most proudest moment as a nurse, or your most proud experience?
Of course. There's been a few. I think most recently, traveling back to New York from South Carolina to work, I had to travel from Charleston to Charlotte and then connect from Charlotte to JFK. And the flight from Charleston to Charlotte was empty and a little bit eerie. And then when I got to Charlotte, it's kind of like where everybody was, meeting up there to connect. And I got on a almost completely full flight, and it was all medical professionals, whether respiratory therapists, nurses, doctors, PT, OT, all types. I'm sure I'm missing a ton, but it was so inspiring. It was kind of like, this is such a polarizing world that we live in, and a very divisive world, especially right now. But to see everyone come together for the greater good, it was moving. And I was proud of, a skill set and the knowledge that I had. And I was proud to be part of something, again, bigger than myself. Yeah, and just the sense of camaraderie that you felt, even, being on a floor and being surrounded by people from all over the country, when there was a huge nursing shortage. Initially, it was, I was proud of that, and I was proud to be there and grateful to be there.
And that gave me the chills, that contrast of an empty plane and a full plane with people like yourselves, essential
Yeah.
health workers. And that
Yeah.
really brings the message home. I had similar experiences in New York, living, in Midtown Manhattan. It was eerily quiet.
Oh,
Many
yes.
days, and it was hard. It was like jarring how quiet it was. And even though it's picking back up, it's still nothing like it was before COVID-19. And again, thank you for getting on that airplane and for coming together with so many others. And it's a similar experience. I've been reading this book called Nursing on the Front Lines, a book from about 10 years ago, but it looks at nurses working in disasters from the mid 1800s until now. And one of the things that they talk about is during disasters and times of crisis, the beauty of people coming together. And I worked during Ebola in West Africa, and having worked in global public health for so many years, I'm used to sort of the competition between different organizations. But during Ebola, all of that washed away, all of the territorialness or, you're in this organization or you're in this organization. We were all one. Mm-hmm. And it was really so different and so beautiful to see that when it all really matters so much that people do come together.
Absolutely. That's such a cool cause to dedicate, your work and your career and your life to.
Yeah, it gives meaning. That's for sure. You said you wanted something with meaning and purpose, and
Yep.
nursing is definitely one of those.
Definitely have it there.
Yeah. Tell us about the journey to return back to the bedside. What were you doing sitting at home, and what sort of pushed you?
So to be honest with you, when everything, beginning of March is kind of when things started to slow down. I know all over the world, but especially in the fashion industry. People were, you're not traveling anywhere, you're not going anywhere. Mm-hmm. And so I was home for the longest amount of time I've ever been home, in 4.5 years. So it was the longest amount of time I'd spent with my husband, the longest amount of time I'd spent with my dogs. And I was doing all of the normal quarantine things. I was watching Netflix. I was making sourdough bread. I was, I had a little bit of a routine, which I really loved. And I almost feel guilty saying this, but it was a really bittersweet time for my husband and I, because it was the longest time that we've really been able to spend together. Even when I was in nursing school, we were long distance. And then when I worked as a nurse, I worked nights and he was working during the day. So we've always kind of missed each other. So it was nice and refreshing to be able to spend time with him. But I really felt like everybody had a responsibility to play during the pandemic. And even now, whether it was, everyone had a responsibility to fight the virus and to protect those most vulnerable. Whether it was staying home and quarantining or getting groceries for, immunocompromised neighbor, an elderly neighbor. I felt like everybody had, such a call that they needed to play out. And I originally wanted to work in Charleston. It would have been not nice to work at the hospital here, but it just would have been a little bit more convenient.
Or you would be home.
Yeah. And, my family's here, not that we could have seen them during it, but I also knew that would come with its own challenges as well, having to quarantine in separate rooms than my husband. But I didn't really have the opportunity to volunteer here. I thought at first I would, but then a lot of nurses were furloughed, and there was a nursing shortage in Charleston. In New York, when it was the epicenter of everything. So I applied to a couple of staffing agencies, and got placed. And, I asked my husband, I was like, do you and the dogs want to come with me? And he was like, I also have my responsibilities here. This is your calling. This is your sacrifice. And everyone has to make them during this time. And so I packed my bags and I went, and it really was amazing. I had another girlfriend, actually one of my best friends from high school, who's a nurse in Denver. She's just brilliant. And she was there for the exact amount of time that I was. Our schedules lined up. And she was one of the ones staying in Times Square, hopping on those buses. And so it was it was nice to have her there as well. You had a little sense of family, of home. But that was kind of my journey back to the bedside. It was kind of just a decision you made, and then you go for it, and you don't really know what's going to happen. Didn't really know what I was getting into. And it was difficult and heavy, and, everything that you would expect, but also things that you wouldn't expect, things that you really couldn't plan for. And I kind of just went with it and did the best that I could. And here we are.
Well, it says a lot about you. And you began the interview by saying, you had the reasons you went into this was to have meaning and purpose. And that clearly spurred you during this time. And you shouldn't have to feel guilty about enjoying those moments at home making sourdough bread. I have a crazy life. I'm on an airplane like you all the time, and make usually 6 to 8 trips to Africa every year, and Asia. And so my life has always been very busy, and this time has been a time to stay grounded, metaphorically and physically. And I've gotten into things I would never get into. I grew tomatoes, and I've done crafting and things I would never do. And there's beauty in that. And I think that's
something you never had time to do.
Exactly. And that time with your family, with your husband, I feel the same way with my daughters, because I was always traveling since they were little. And I think people need to remember that even during the bad, good comes out, and there are things we can be grateful for. And I think, it is a reminder to all of us of all those blessings and things we have in our lives that we take for granted a lot of the time as well.
I totally agree with that.
So I want to switch now. We're going through an upsurge in cases, and I wonder what brings you fear about the pandemic, the COVID pandemic.
I think that for me personally, the fear of the unknown with this pandemic is what I find, to be pretty scary, to be pretty heavy. Obviously death is something that everyone is afraid of with this. I lost my grandmother to COVID this summer.
Sorry.
But no, she was old, and she lived a beautiful long life. But it was unnecessary, and it could have been prevented. And I think that's the hardest part. But I do know, I do know that she lived, a beautiful long life, and she was very privileged. But I think just the fear of the unknown. And I think that right now, on top of, this pandemic with the cases rising, I think that a lot of people are kind of interpreting data to fit whatever agenda they have going on right now. And a lot of times you'll see people, on social media posting something, and you're like, this is not even interpreted the correct way.
Exactly.
And instead of this bringing you comfort, this should bring you fear.
Yes.
And so I think a lot of the misinformation I find to be terrifying as well, and that people who have no business interpreting this data are doing it and pushing an agenda. And I think, it's hard to come across facts, and people aren't listening to science.
Right.
And I find that to be scary.
I completely agree with you. And I think, the hardest part about this pandemic is personal behavior and people's behavior, and the way we as a society are responding, because it is in our control. like you said, your grandmother did not have to have this.
Yeah.
It is within our control. Obviously, those first days when we were learning what this was,
Of
and this is a
course.
novel virus, and it's surprising. But now, weeks, months, almost
We
into
know.
a year, we know about this. We know more. So quickly we've learned about this virus, and but yet we still struggle and are seeing an uptick. I agree with you, and that is fearful because we're reliant on each other. We require all of us in this together, and when
Absolutely.
we're not, I agree, that makes it fearful. Definitely. On the opposite side, what brings you hope during this COVID pandemic?
I think what brings me hope during this COVID pandemic, that human beings are so resilient. I think that, you know, and this, I could also feel guilty saying this as well, but it kind of was a forced stop for a lot of people. People had to stop what they were doing. They had to stay home. I think that there's been a silver lining through all of this, other than, human beings, being resilient and finding a vaccine and working together. Those things all, of course, bring me hope. Apart from that, I think that there's been a lot of grounding. I think that people have had, realizations that they wouldn't have had otherwise because they were forced to slow down. I think it really made people stop and focus on what's important in life, the small things, to really question, what is fulfilling and what isn't, and what you're chasing after. Is that worth it? Is it not? I think that there has been so much good throughout this too. And I think that I've had to kind of focus on the silver lining. Otherwise I was going to go crazy. But these moments with family, like the time that I got with my husband was, I mean, irreplaceable to me. And I think that brings me hope, and seeing people come together. When I was working at the hospital, there were men and women there who were sleeping at the hospital. I mean, making the most insane sacrifices to help other people. They weren't seeing their own children. They weren't seeing their husbands, their partners. That kind of blew my mind. And I was there for a month, and these people stayed living at the hospital for months, taking care of others, other people's loved ones, and being there with them in their hardest, toughest moments. That was inspiring to see, humankind kind of come together for a greater good again. And I think there's a lot of things to find hope in during all of this.
Beautifully said, and I completely agree. And you made me reminisce when I was young. There was the famine in Ethiopia, and I wasn't very old. I don't remember how old I was, maybe 13 or 14, and I was crying sitting in front of the television. And my father was clearly upset at me seeing this, and he said to me, "Susan, remember there is always good in the world."
Yeah.
And there is always good.
Wow.
And I was an athlete, and he said, "Susan, look at athletes and what they can do." And that has always stuck with me. And, I've worked in HIV during the worst parts of it in the 1980s and 1990s, and during Ebola. And these things are really, really hard. And so despite that all, we keep going. And I think you hit the nail on the head. It is this ability of people to come together at the worst moments and do amazing things. And again,
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, and just, it was interesting just to see people put aside all of their differences. It didn't matter, what your political stance was. It didn't matter your race, your religion, your likes, your dislikes. Everyone came together and worked together, for something bigger than themselves.
Yeah. And during this time of uncertainty and division, I think we really have to hold on to that.
I do too. 100% agree.
Yeah, well, thank you. I want to end by asking, you've said so much and really warmed my heart in a lot of ways, just reminiscing as a fellow nurse. How do you think nurses are unique in promoting the health of communities and countries and the world? What do you think it is about nursing?
I think that nurses have stepped up time and time again. I think that they are one of the most, if not the most valuable asset during these, hard times, during a crisis. I feel like nurses are always the first ones to step up. And whether they're giving, direct patient care in the hospital or organizing, large scale public health organizations like yourself, they play such a vital role. And, this pandemic has hit all levels of society. It has affected everything. And I feel like nurses have really stepped up to the calling. And, if you look back in history, they always have. They always have stepped up. With the Spanish flu pandemic, I was reading about that a couple months ago, and the comparisons between what COVID-19 looks like, and nurses have always been the ones to run to the front line, whether it's patient education, whether it's data interpretation. There's so many things that their skill set allows them to do, and it has just been so inspiring and humbling to see it and witness it firsthand and up close and personal. And I know that I have been personally really moved and inspired, by these men and women. But yeah, I think that they wear so many hats in this time. And just they've always stepped up. And I don't know, it's really been mind blowing. We had nurses here, giving rapid COVID testing. We had nurses here doing like patient education and then education for the public. There's so many different roles and so many different areas of expertise. But I've just seen them do it all. Volunteering. There's been a little bit of everything, but yeah.
Yeah. And that's what I really love about nursing, is that it's in schools, it's in churches, it's in communities, it's in public health centers, and it's at the front line, whether that's in a disaster or in an intensive care unit or an emergency unit. And I love the idea of stepping up. Well, Maggie, you've been one of those people who stepped up, and it's been a real privilege to have you with us today. And
thank you so much for having me. I'm so honored. Thank you.
Yes. Great, thank you. This year, as you know, is the year of the nurse and the midwife, as we celebrate the nurses and midwives in our individual lives, like Maggie Rawlins, in our communities and our world. It is a time to focus on what matters by building more resilient and well-trained frontline health workers. Health systems will be strengthened, not only in the course of normal operations, but more importantly, during times of crisis. Thank you all for listening in.